Welcome everybody in person to the Side Business School. My name is Pegram Harrison. I'm a lecturer here in entrepreneurship, and I also have a shady past as a PhD in English. And so it gives me a very particular pleasure to introduce our event today that combines entrepreneurship and English literature. Also, it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Professor Emma Smith, who has been a great supporter of this series, Engaging with the Humanities, which is an opportunity for us to showcase some of the jewels of Oxford's crown in the humanities particularly, and to bring them to the business school to share their scholarship and wisdom with new audiences in a new context, and perhaps to inform new audiences in new ways. Emma has very kindly talked to us before, but not on this subject. So this is a new adventure, and also a particular pleasure given the timing. Shakespeare's folio had its 400th anniversary ending last year, well, this year, and that's been the subject of Emma's most recent work and engagement, so she'll talk a bit about that. But rather than say anything more about what to expect, I'll just ask you please to join me in welcoming Professor Emma Smith.
Thanks so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Just a reminder before we start that we take all questions through the online portal, the people who are in the room and the people who are not in the room, rather than by raising your hand. So I think somewhere there will probably be a QR code, won't there? But if you see a QR code, that's for you to ask questions. So fantastic. Put questions through as you want to while I'm talking. It's really, really great to be back. We were just talking about the last time I was here was in that sort of before times moment, which just seems like another, a completely other age. So it's really brilliant to be back with colleagues and friends here in the business school. And one of the reasons I've so enjoyed the opportunity of being here is in the past, and I'm sure again today, is the encouragement, the kind of provocation to think about my material a little bit differently. So in the literary world, we tend to be thinking about sort of forms of literary value, forms of aesthetic value, and those are really a crucial sort of corrective, aren't they, to a theory of value, which is all economic. But also art does not get produced apart from within economic structures. It may get produced, it doesn't get to its consumers. We don't know about the art that is not produced within some kind of economic context. We don't know about the books that don't get published. We don't know about the art that never gets displayed. We don't know about the theatre that doesn't get put on. So there's a hugely important economic dimension to all art, which I think is really, really rewards our study, and particularly in thinking about the Elizabethan theatre. So Shakespeare, born in 1564, is an example of someone who has a career which was unthinkable, literally unthinkable to his parents, because that career did not exist. So he's like being a sort of social media influencer or something now, where the parents are saying, what even is that? What even is a playwright? Because as I'm going to go on to show, he is at a particular form in the development of theatre, the commercial development of theatre, which enables and supports and stimulates his career, which has dimensions in performance but also in print, and which follows certain kinds of business models that we might recognise from new technologies in our own period. That's to say, a kind of melee of new ideas and new companies all vying for a similar part of the market, which establishes itself into perhaps a duopoly or even a monopoly. We then feel worried about the monopoly, so we sort of try and break it up again and have a bit more variety. We can see audience segmentation, market segmentation happening in some quite recognisable ways, as well as some things which are not so familiar to us. So that's what I want to try and go through this lunchtime. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, then we'll have a chance to take some questions. So, The first thing I want to establish is that in this period, the second half of the 16th century, theatre changes. And it changes, let's say, from being a verb to being a noun. It changes from something that you do to a place where you go. So the medieval period, which I've sort of indicated here, has lots of drama. You know, drama. Don't let me sort of overstate the case. Drama does not get invented in this period. There's been theatrical entertainment. There's been travelling drama. Drama has been an important part of people's lives, for many centuries. And in the medieval period, it's an extremely important part of community life. But the way that drama usually works is that players, travelling groups of actors, move from place to place. And they come and perform maybe in your market square, maybe in your hall, guild hall, or something like that. Or they perform for a particular saint's day. They might perform, as we can see, an example of there, a religious play, often around Easter time, the so-called mystery plays. What's important about that is that theatre comes to you wherever you are, so it's a dispersed activity, and it occurs in locations at particular times of the year. And what's also important about it is it's a very active theatrical culture which has absolutely no need for new plays, because it works by getting new audiences for the same play. That's its business model, if you like. You take the same play around and you have a different audience every few days because you've moved to a different place. And what we're going to see is a complete flip of that business model, where you have a theatre which you need people to come to. You need them to make repeat visits in order for your business model to work, and therefore you need lots of new plays. And that's the new career, the playwright career, that Shakespeare and many other people moves into. So what we start to see in the sort of last quarter of the 16th century is a move towards purpose-built theatres in London. And that change comes about for a whole range of reasons, and actually over a long period. So I'm going to talk in particular about the Rose Theatre, which opens in 1587, and we'll come to that in a minute. But the Rose is not the first theatre. There is theatre activity increasing in the City of London through the 16th century, which establishes the sort of preconditions for purpose-built theatres to be developed. That's to say, these earlier iterations, often in inn-yards or in existing spaces, is part of a long period of what you might call market testing, establishing that there is an audience, building that audience, and then trying to attend to that audience in a different way through the building of purpose-built theatre. And the real reason that theatres develop in London in this period, theatre buildings do not develop anywhere else in the country, and that's really because, like many developing economies that we might see around the world now, England has one very big city and a growing city, London, and really almost nowhere else of any significant population at all. So Norwich is usually given as England's second city, but it's about a tenth of the size of London, and the proportions are, the change is widening. So what we've got is a big city that is pulling people in through internal migration from elsewhere in England. Shakespeare is an example of that, goes from Stratford-upon-Avon to London. If he wants to have a career in the theatre, which it looks as if he does, that's what he has to do, because that's where that's the only place where you can follow that career. So what we see is a kind of entertainment industry, the theatre, which develops very much, I think, in step with the growth of the city. So in order for an entertainment industry to develop, you need certain economic conditions to be in place, don't you? And that's why the growth of the theatre in this period tells us all kinds of really interesting things about people's levels of disposable income. what they might choose and their leisure time. We're still a little bit unclear why theatre performances which take place in the afternoons, because they take place in daylight, how they quite meet working people. What's quite happening there? How does that timetabling really work? That's still a little bit unclear, but what we do see is that the theatre is able both to get paying audiences and audiences that have the time to come. So both of those factors tell us something about a wider sort of socioeconomic demographic of the theatre. The other picture there is just to remind us that part of the growth of London, I think the growth of London really develops around two main centres. One is trade, and that really is organised around the Thames. This is a time when the City of London really has as its main thoroughfare the Thames. And if you do a Thames boat trip now, you can see that many of the older buildings along the Thames really had their most grand entrance onto the river. And there's a period, usually in the 18th century, when they turn the building round to face the road, because road transport improves. But 16th and 17th century London is really organised around the river. London is a very major trading port, and trade, mercantile activity, buying and selling, not producing, that is London's main, the main driver for London's economic growth. But also London becomes the centre for the legal courts, the legal system, the legal terms that we still have. Michaelmas term is a really major part of the calendar in the London legal world. Most gentry, aristocratic people are often in London for that period. This is a time when almost everybody is going to law. It's an extraordinary outpouring of legal activity. People go to law about everything. The law courts are absolutely packed with business, major and minor, and so lots of people are flocking to the legal courts and to the royal court, particularly as Elizabeth ages. So Queen Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558. Earlier on in her career, she tends to do what's called go on progress. She goes around. The court is a kind of, a bit like the theatre, is a peripatetic entity. She goes round to stay with people at, for example, Kenilworth, just in Warwickshire, just north of us. She does that, I think, in part to be seen by more of her people. There's some clever element where Elizabeth's seeming to keep her very wealthiest courtiers in check by inviting herself and 400 hangers-on to stay for 3 or 4 weeks, and just to damp down the potential expenditure they might spend on other kinds of perhaps less cooperative aspects of her reign. By the second half of her reign, she's moving. That is much less common, and there's more of a sense that the court is established in London and that people come to it. And that too makes a big boost to London, and means that although all kinds of people, aristocratic or gentry people, have houses or seats, as we call them, elsewhere in England, they're nevertheless spending a lot of time in London, and London is buzzing with that. So population is a really important factor in this new industry. It's no surprise that it only happens really in London. That's the only place that can sustain these theatre buildings, and that it shifts, as I've already said, the business model of the travelling theatre to ensure that people make repeat visits to the theatre in this period. So, I'm just going to talk very briefly about The Rose, which is an interesting example of an early theatre, and interesting because it enables us to talk a bit about what kinds of evidence we have to talk about this period. So The Rose on Bankside has had a lot of archaeology, really, really fascinating archaeology most recently. The modern understanding of the Elizabethan theatre is a little bit dominated by Shakespeare's Globe, which you might have been to on Bankside, which is a brilliant reconstruction in all kinds of aspects of an Elizabethan theatre. They've sort of swallowed up a bit the energy around the theatre in this part of London. But The Rose was probably a very important precursor. And what's most important about the archaeology of The Rose on the Bankside, which you can go and see, I really, really recommend it, is that it shows us that this theatre was built in 1587 and underwent quite quickly a renovation. So The Rose 1, as it were, it lasts from 1587 to 1591, and by 1591 they need to expand. And they expand two things. Those red lines are part of the archaeological drawing to show the perimeter on the left-hand slide, the perimeter of the site. But the one with the parallel line shows how the wall moves outwards, and particularly shows how the stage changes. And I've been really, really fascinated by this insight it gives us into what the stage looked like. Because the model in the Globe Theatre, the rebuilt theatre on Bankside, is of a relatively square stage. We sometimes call it a thrust stage because we think it sort of juts out into the yard and spectators are on 3 or even 4 sides. What The Rose seems to have had, it doesn't have what we call a proscenium arch. That was a kind of classical way of thinking about theatre in later periods, so that there's sort of a picture frame almost around the theatre, around the stage. It's not like that at all, but nevertheless, it's not a square stage. It's a rectangular one. It doesn't have much depth. It has very extensive width. So it feels to me almost like what movies have understood as a kind of widescreen format or a kind of letterbox format. You know, it's quite interesting to think about how these ratio aspects in other kinds of visual formats might be possible to sort of back project or retrofit onto this theatre. It certainly seems that they want a wider and narrower theatre rather than a sort of squarer and deeper one. And that tells us all kinds of things about what kinds of entertainment they wanted to put on. One of the things that people love to see was a lot of fighting, and lots of plays have lots of fighting in it, and you can see that a long wide stage is good for getting, you know, that kind of activity, physical activity. Chasing, you know, the kind of physical work of theatre was much more important to early theatre than, you know, close dialogue between two characters. This is not what this stage is really designed to showcase. It's a much more active kind of theatre. And that helps us think a little bit about some older assumptions that we tended to have about the theatre of this period, which was that it was a very verbal experience. Scenery is relatively limited in this kinds of theatre, and so one of the things that plays tend to do is establish their setting verbally. They establish it through words. So you may know the very opening of Hamlet, which takes place on the battlements in Elsinore. There's an entire exchange for about 60 lines, the main purpose of which is to say to the audience, it's nighttime, ignore the fact that it's daytime, in the fiction where it's nighttime. That's really all it's doing. So people are saying, who's there? I can't see you. Did the clock just strike 12? Oof, it's cold tonight. I've never known a night as cold as this. Give me your lantern. You know, so this is a kind of verbal world which is trying to establish at odds really with what you're seeing. And we've tended to go with that and to think verbal. These are plays about words, and the fact that the plays survive for us in scripts which are words, and the fact that most of the people who study these plays have a sort of professional interest in words rather than other things has all piled on top of that. But if we look back at the early theatres, We can see that they're producing stages, they're developing, they're refurbishing stages with a particular view to action and to activity on the stage. So the archaeology of the Bankside is really, really fascinating. And it's partly been, of course, all these, the economics of the past and the economics of the present are always in a kind of dialogue. It's because of the development of this area in the present day. It's because of the way that the Thames has revived itself as a sort of highly desirable sort of thoroughfare in London, that all this work has happened, all this construction work has happened, and it's construction work always which reveals archaeology. It's a great paradox for archaeologists that they don't really want construction work because it will destroy archaeology, but without construction work you never reveal what's there at all. So Bankside is a really lively place as we're learning a lot more about those theatres. And I just thought I'd give you this description of where we're thinking about. So I've already talked about the Bankside, but this is quite a nice diagram, I think, of the London theatres around 1600. So if we just step back from that a minute, I've said the Rose opens in 1587 and is refurbished in 1591. The Globe is bought and it's constructed by Shakespeare's company in 1599. So that 20 years between the 1580s and the end of the 16th century is the sort of the moment in the theatre as an industry which is a kind of free-for-all. That's to say, it's about lots and lots of small companies doing their thing. Some of them have their own theatres, but most of them are camping out in theatres, in theatre buildings, and working on a very different kind of financial model. What happens is that the companies that have the theatres are coming to dominate. They can control not just the plays and the performances, but the space that those are in. We can see all kinds of associated marketing that you would expect. If you go to the theatre now, where does the profit come? It comes from the bar. That's why, all theatre productions, really, however damaging this might be to the experience of the play, has to have an interval. I've talked to loads and loads of theatre directors in the modern theatre who would like to do a version of, say, Macbeth in a sort of helter-skelter hour and 50 minutes with no break. But it's completely financially impossible because of the money that the theatre makes in the interval. So we know that associated, particularly sales, that must be the case about the cinema, mustn't it? How can popcorn and sweets be so expensive? How can that be? And we can see that that's a huge captive market making large profits for those companies. And we start to see the same here with companies that own their own theatres. They clearly have franchises or food available, drink available. They are providing a whole lot of consumer benefits for people who come to the theatre, and that starts to tip the industry towards them. So around 1600, we're starting to see the theatre industry, I think, coalesce around major companies, and some of that diversity, some of that the small different companies have been subsumed. What we're also seeing, though, is a regulatory environment which is not that keen on the theatre, and that's why the round red dots, which are purpose-built theatres, are all outside that brown line and to the south of the Thames. The line represents the City of London. So the City of London authorities are not at all keen on theatre. They're not keen on it really for two reasons. One is, in sort of general terms, the sense that performance, make-believe, perhaps people pretending to be kings or more elevated people than they actually are, that this all makes is not properly moral. Is not moral because it's fictional and it's lying, but it's not moral because it doesn't show people doing bad things and being punished. In fact, the theatre loves people doing bad things, and that's what makes fascinating plays. It's not at all interested really in the kind of moral teaching, or only, I think, at a very in a very distanced way. So the City of London perhaps are right to say theatres don't think of themselves as having a moral purpose, but they're also worried about crowd control. So some of these theatres we think are quite large. The South Bank theatres in Southwark may have had 2,000, 2,500 people in them. We can see that if you think about when people stream out of a sports stadium or something, there's usually quite a lot of people to handle them being reabsorbed into the city, isn't there? Helping them cross the road or making sure that this great sort of outflux, as it were, of people moves in a steady and sober and proper way back into the mainstream of public life and the public space. We don't have any institution like that in the early modern period. No police force, no security force, no marshals or stewards or any of those kind of crowd control things. And one of the aspects that the city is worried about is all these people coming out a bit pumped up from seeing some exciting drama, and how do they behave themselves in London, and how is that going to be managed? So what we get is a model which I always think of when sometimes you cross a state boundary when you're driving in the US, and you realise that taxes or something is completely different just on the other side of the boundary, because you get then, or something is allowed that wasn't allowed, you get now cannabis or liquor stores, or you get luxury stores because the tax is different or something. You get a strip which registers that you've just crossed the border, and people will just come across the border to participate in those in those commercial opportunities. Something is kind of true about similar is true here, that people are going out of the city. Particularly if they're going to the South Bank, they are probably going by boat. You can see the River Thames has got one bridge there, London Bridge, but all the other bridges that go across the Thames now are later, so the majority of visits to the South Bank to Southwark would have been by boat. So we can start to see a whole lot of associated industries which grow up. A taxi service across the river, and a taxi service which of course has what we might call surge pricing, a bit like Uber. So it costs a lot more when the tide is coming in because it's a lot harder to row than when the tide is going out. But we can see that what I find really interesting about this whole industry is the ways in which it develops associated commercial opportunities, not exactly gentrification. I don't think we see the South Bank of London get gentrified, which is one of the economic benefits that we've seen in lots of other places, haven't we? Through arts activities, that was a big part of New York's gentrification in the 1980s. Lots of other kind of international locations. It's not exactly that happens, but it is that there is a huge amount of spin-off entrepreneurial activity related to the theatres. And some of that, of course, is dubious. These are businesses that we wouldn't really want to engage with perhaps now. Many of the theatre entrepreneurs are also involved in animal baiting. That's another big entertainment, and some of the theatres are designed to be alternate plays and animal baiting. It's the same kind of shape, it's the same kind of facilities that you need. And prostitution, sex work is a big part of the associated work around the theatres. And I think that sometimes when you read those, extraordinary, troubling, but just extraordinary reviews of the amount of sex work that, for example, a big sports event generates, an event where people travel to see sport, generates this enormous amount of money in the black economy, not least in sex work. So there's kind of something interesting going on there. And I've given you just at the bottom there from an early engraving of London, two buildings which look almost identical, the Bear Garden and the Globe. You can see that they're built on the same model. And in fact, we think that Wenceslas Holler, the engraver here, has actually mixed them up. Because they seem so similar, they look similar, they're doing similar things, they're similar in the way that he understands what's going on in this part of London. So at this time in the theatre, in the theatre's development, it's an interesting paradox. It has large numbers of people attending. Probably, we're going to talk a bit about audiences in a minute, from quite a wide social spectrum. But it is also slightly out with the sort of civic organisation of London. It's a little bit on the margins. It's a little bit transgressive or a little bit questionable. And partly, I think, the theatre embraces that identity very much. This is not an absolutely respectable thing to go to, and that's part of the fun of it. Now, some of how I talked about archaeology as one of the pieces of evidence. One other really important piece of evidence we've got is the plays that get printed from this theatre world. I mean, the first thing to say is most plays don't go into print. Most plays have done their job by being plays. And it is not, if play printing is another peripheral industry or another entrepreneurial spin-off from the theatre, it has its own sort of protocols and its own priorities. We think that we have lost about 80% of the plays that were performed in the period from about, say, the first theatre work in around 1570 through to the closing of the theatres in 1642. We think that 80% of those plays have not survived largely because they were never printed. And they were never printed, presumably, because there was no market for people to read them. And what we see in this period, and we're going to end up with Shakespeare's first folio as a particular kind of milestone, one of the things we see adjacent to the development of theatres and of performance cultures is an associated print culture that's to do with theatrical performance, but which is finding its own way economically, finding its own market. We don't know, for example, whether the people who bought plays were people who went to the theatre or who didn't go to the theatre. I mean, you could argue that either way, couldn't you? You could say the play book is a sort of book of the film, so it's the spin-off. You would only buy the book of the film if you'd seen the film and liked it, wouldn't you? Nobody buys the book of the film unless they've seen the film. Or it could be that the playbook is what you look at if you are a literate woman who might not want to go to the theatre because it's not a very appropriate place for you, or somebody who lives outside London or whatever. And the printers, publishers, stationers, that entrepreneurial world of print, they are experimenting with whether there is a market for play scripts, whether there is a readership. And it's not certain to them at this point that there is, just as maybe it's not so certain for us that there would be. I had really enjoyed Succession and was very sorry that it ended. I would never dream of thinking, let's find the screenplay of Succession. It doesn't relate to what I enjoyed about the experience, and the same may be true of play texts here. But partly why I wanted to show you these ones is the way that they show an industry. They show something about print as an industry, but there may be evidence for something about the theatre industry too. So they're going in chronological order. From earliest, the most lamentable Roman tragedy of Titus Andronicus. You can even see that just across those three, they're sorting out the design of a title page, aren't they? There's coming to see. You might use the type size to direct attention to what's most important. And what's most important is not the most lamentable Roman tragedy of Titus Andronicus. You might think what's important is not chronicle either, but that's getting a bit more organised. By the time we get to King Lear, Master William Shakespeare is much more important on the title page than the title of King Lear. So we can see something about print as an industry developing and maybe stabilising, but we can also see something about the companies that are being discussed. So the most lamentable tragedy of Titus Andronicus comes out in 1594, but the performance tradition that it's talking about, as was played by, and then that list of different companies, that almost certainly refers to, a period of maybe 5 years previously. And what you can see is that we don't know whether this means it was either performed by a kind of mashup of all these companies, or it was a property which passed between different theatre companies. It could be either, and we don't really have clear evidence about that. But by the time we get to Henry V, which comes out in 1600, you can see that this is very clearly the property of the Chamberlain's men. And the Chamberlain's men who sign a shareholding agreement in 1594. Shakespeare is one of the founding members of that troupe, who then establish their own theatre 5 years later with the Globe. They are in control of their own plays and then their own space, so they're developing a different kind of model. But by the time of King Lear, 1608, you can see that there's an advert for the Globe Theatre. So if we go down that slightly optician's page, as it hath been, as played before the King upon St. Stephen's Night, at Whitehall upon St. Stephen's Night in Christmas holidays. We'll talk perhaps a little bit about royal performances in a minute, but by the King's, by His Majesty's servants, usually at the Globe in Bankside. So you can see that the play text, the name of the playing company, and then by the time of King Lear, their usual home are all stabilising from Titus Andronicus, with a number of play companies kind of vying for attention on the front, through to this more established industrial position just over 10 years later. So if we go back to, we're just going to think about this in terms of prices now. So the early theatres charge a penny for entrance. And that seems to be a relatively stable figure, perhaps for 10 or 20 years. A penny is the entrance price to the theatre. Now, like many industries, it has a low headline price and what you might call lots of in-app purchases. So lots and lots of opportunities to spend much more. We've already talked a bit about the concessions and about food and drink and so on, but also you could pay more in these early theatres. Interestingly, you could pay more to be further away from the stage. So the ticket price arrangement that we have now comes from a slightly later period than this. What you're paying for here is privacy, seclusion, space around you. Still, actually, if you go to Shakespeare's Globe on Bankside, the cheapest ticket is to stand in the yard right up by the actors. You often will see a lot of back and forth between the actors and the people standing there. That can feel a very dynamic and intimate place to be with the performers, and that people who want more comfort, more quiet, are paying to be further away and to have a covered place to sit outside of the sun or the rain or whatever. And they're paying more and more and more for each of the tiers that they go up around the theatre. But 1 pence is the standard entrance, and 1 pence is usually said to be the equivalent of 2 pints of beer. So that's an interesting parallel for us now. What would that be? 10, 12 pounds commercial prices of beer? That's not far off a kind of entry ticket It's not far off cinema ticket prices, which we might think of as closer to theatre ticket prices in this period, but it's not far off the kind of young person's ticket or the entry ticket that we see in lots and lots of theatres. So what's important about the theatre here at this point is that it's a business model which is lots of people paying not very much. So it's a mass market. A profit comes from the extent, from the number of participants, not from the margins on those participants, I think. And just, there's a picture of the globe which gives you that sense of the people who are closest up to the stage. They're the people who are paying least in this model, as they would have done in the 16th century. And the people who are around in those galleries, which you can just see, are spending more. And it is possible that the rooms over the stage that you can just see there could, at some performances, have been occupied by people who are paying a huge amount for that privilege. There are some theatres where people can pay to sit on the stage, and that's a development which is starting to make going to the theatre being itself an act of display. You know, we're quite conscious of that, I think, when you look at movies about people going to the opera or going to something, and they're showing off their own clothing and their own who they're with, and they're looking across with those opera glasses and seeing, oh, there's such and such a person with, you know, that notorious harlot, or, you know, I feel as if we've all seen that kind of movie. This is just starting to happen there, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about how theatre starts to become more about higher spending, higher status patrons, and starts to develop ways of meeting their sort of consumer demands. And that's with these indoor theatres, I think. The Globe on Bankside has done a fantastic job, which I really recommend to you if you ever get the chance to go, in building an indoor theatre called the Sam Wanamaker Theatre. And it's not precisely what the Blackfriars was, which was Shakespeare's equivalent, but in many, many ways it gives an idea of that. So in 1608, Shakespeare's company add to the Globe an indoor theatre called Blackfriars. And by indoor, it means that it is in a kind of hall where people come out of the weather, you know, out of the daylight, into a very controlled environment. One of the most important things that's controlled about the environment is the lighting. So I described at the beginning of Hamlet saying, you know, we're verbally trying to say to you, this is night. But what the Blackfriars can do, and what the Sam Wanamaker in our own age does, is to show us that, and to show us internal spaces with a lot of intimacy, even a lot of voyeurism. One of the things we get in the plays that are written for the Blackfriars is an almost pornographic sense that we're right up there in the bedroom with them, or we're right up seeing this. We're sort of in places where we shouldn't be, where we're up and close. And what the playwrights write for these theatres is these stories about corruption and kind of sexual depravity and so on, because that's partly what people are being drawn into this very, very intimate space to enjoy. But it's also much, much more expensive. So if we're thinking about 2 pints of beer as the penny for the Globe, perhaps we're thinking more like 2 glasses of champagne here, which I would say reckon to be kind of £35, something like that, for a ticket, for a single ticket. So you can see that is a hugely different proposition. It's a much, much smaller theatre, which costs much more to go to. So this is effectively the kind of boutique theatre. This is about how you make your money in a different way by charging people an awful lot more for a more limited or bespoke or sort of less hoi polloi kind of experience. You make people feel that they can pay to be in a special and high status place, and they're willing to pay quite a lot for that. And what Shakespeare's company do, I think very, very commercially effectively and also artistically effectively, is to toggle between those 2 venues. And I've just given you an example from the printed edition of Othello, which says it's been lately performed at the Globe and at Blackfriars. So that's saying something about the kinds of where that play might find itself. Part of part of the problem about Blackfriars was again a problem about people gathering together, and particularly I like this because it's really the first one of the first issues about parking. This is people in the neighbourhood saying people are coming to the theatre in coaches, and it's hell for us. It's absolutely hell. Coaches become a thing that well-to-do people have. They become much more affordable, much more part of a well-to-do lifestyle in the first decades of the 17th century. Before, you would be more likely to travel on horseback, but not to have a coach. A cart was a thing that you would transport a big load of sort of lumber of some sort on, not that you would travel on as a kind of gracious way to travel. But coaches develop in their technology, roads improve a little bit, and it becomes the sort of exactly the kind of person who the company want to go to Blackfriars is the kind of person who would also have a coach, and hence these problems. So we're starting to see a bit a theatre, which I wanted to point out here, which is starting to go up market. So what was the problem? What was the fear about the earlier theatres was that they were likely to be riotous or disruptive in some way. And my analogy there was a kind of sports match. Here we've got a different sense of what the problem of these people might be, which is that they're too wealthy and that their demands are blocking up the streets. But it's a sense that theatre is starting to appeal to a higher paying, higher status clientele, and is moving away from that more general one that we saw. And we could argue that in most countries, in most Western countries, the theatre has continued that movement away from a wide audience towards a more particular one. Lots and lots of examples of play texts in print, which we perhaps won't dwell on now, but we can always talk about in questions if you would like to. And I thought I'd just point out a couple of things about the way the commercial opportunities of the theatre shape what gets produced there. So if I'd been a person in my position teaching Shakespeare, talking about these issues 50 or 100 years ago, I would probably have been saying, what a shame that Shakespeare had to sort of contort himself to meet these commercial pressures. That the attitude would have been that it was rather regrettable that Shakespeare had to, sort of bend his art, bend his poetic genius to something as pragmatic and as ordinary as the theatre. I don't think we think like that now, and I think we think it wasn't an accident that Shakespeare's genius, which I think he has, is nurtured and enabled by the theatre. That's not an accident. It's kind of it's not a bug. It's a feature. That's what the theatre is doing. The commercial demands of the theatre produce an environment in which artists can find an audience for extraordinarily interesting and complex work. But it also offers some other possibilities too. Now, this is one example that I really enjoy. I think if we look at these two titles, for me, that establishes the second part of Henry IV, really, and I think we've got another, as a sequel. This is really Henry IV 2. So this is not, if we were thinking about a different modern cinematic analogy, if we were thinking about the Lord of the Rings films, which are one big story divided into 3 episodes. We always knew there were 3 episodes, and that the 3 episodes were needed to tell this one story. This is much more like the other phenomenon which we're used to in the modern cinema, where a story which isn't completely sort of tied up and finished at the end, which has just enough loose ends that could be unpicked to have a sequel, and is commercially successful, could be reproduced and done again. Most sequels in the modern cinema are not thought to be as good as the originals, and that's kind of a bit the case with the second part of Henry IV also. So the history of Henry IV, it never gets called Henry IV Part 1 until the first folio, which we'll see in a minute. So it continues to be printed as the history of Henry IV and is very, very popular in print. This second part of Henry IV just has one edition, never gets reprinted, and is generally thought to have been, a kind of disappointing attempt to recapture what was so great about the first one. But part of what was so great about the first one was we'd never seen it before. And you can see that there, the second one is riffing on the things that were popular. Sorry about that on the microphone there. You can see that they're riffing on what was popular, the humorous conceits of Sir John Falstaff, and then with the humours of Sir John Falstaff and swaggering pistols. So they're trying to build on the popularity of one to sell the second, not entirely successfully, we think. Actors, one of the other developments in the theatre, I think, is a move towards star actors. A move towards actors that people go to and would recognise. A kind of actor-driven theatre makes connections across different plays in some ways which perhaps we haven't been all that attentive to. That man there is Richard Burbage, the tragic actor that Shakespeare wrote his great parts for, Hamlet, Lear, Antony, Prospero in The Tempest. And the jester figure is a comic actor called Will Kemp, who played the comic parts, possibly including Falstaff, who we've just encountered in the early part of Shakespeare's career. And we know that these are really popular figures. We've got the start of kind of celebrity or fan culture. There's a play, a student play in Cambridge, which is all about how much they look up to Burbage and how interested they are in these actors. And we've got a few bits of evidence emerging, some of which I've been looking at, that suggest that wealthy people could recruit actors to come to a dinner party and do a little turn, do their best speech or do something, and get extra money for that. We can see quite a few examples of that once you start to look for it. So actors become celebrities, slightly independent of the theatre, but one of the ways the theatre develops is through actor celebrity, much more, I think, than through author celebrity. So I think actors become a big draw, much more than authors. And this is some material about Richard Burbage, who dies in 1619. He dies in the same year as the Queen, James's Queen Anna. And in fact, James issues a very cross proclamation saying, why has nobody been very sad about Queen Anne? And you've all been writing these elegies about Richard Burbage. People were much more upset that this actor had died than that the Queen had died. And my favourite of these elegies, the one at the larger font at the bottom, suggests that all the characters he played have also died with him, which is a great thought. We tend to think of particularly classic drama as being open to different actors to embody these characters, but this is a view that these were characters attached to a particular person, a particular actor, and they would never be revived after the death of Burbage. But my favourite of the elegies for this actor, this great actor, which we can look at in its entirety, is this one, Exit Burbage, which seems a great way to think about a kind of obituary for an actor. I'm going to move past this one, and I'm just going to talk very briefly about royal performances. So one of the other paradoxes about the theatre in this period is that it starts at least being quite a down-market activity. We've already talked about that. But it has the patronage of noblemen. That's why we get the Lord Chamberlain's servants or Sussex's servants, and later, in fact, the King's men, His Majesty's servants. So all the theatre companies have the patronage of somebody noble. And increasingly they come to perform at court, usually at Christmas. So they become part of the entertainment at court. And we can see two examples here. One is Love's Labour's Lost, presented before Her Highness this last Christmas, and then King Lear, which we've already seen, presented before the King on Boxing Day in 1607, which must have been pretty miserable, I would have thought. It's not quite The Wizard of Oz, is it, or something? And we've also got another relatively high status performance space here in the City of London, also in the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, for the tragical history of Hamlet. We've no evidence that that's actually true. It may be true, but it may be a marketing ploy, and that is also very, very interesting. We know that certain Shakespeare plays are performed in Oxford, but the authorities in Oxford at the beginning of the 17th century are very, very worried about town gown troubles. They're very worried about occasions where people will gather together, and the records show that they're much, much more likely to pay actors to go away than they are to have them performing. I said I would end up here, and this is something which we can pick up in the questions. So 400 years ago, plus 2 weeks, this book, the collected works of Shakespeare, the first collected plays of Shakespeare, a book which we now call the First Folio, was printed in London. This is the Bodleian's rather chewed up copy, which I like very much. It's a sign that it's been read and been used. So it's a collected edition of 36 plays divided into comedies, histories and tragedies. What's important, many things are important about this book, which are subjects for another time. But the ones I would just highlight here to finish off what I've been saying about this whistle-stop tour through the ways the theatre establishes itself in the 30 or so years at the end of the 16th into the 17th century. The things I would say is, this is an expensive book. It costs £1. If we go back to our pints of beer, remember they were a penny. There are 240 pennies in an old pound. So 480 pints of beer, that's a lot of money. So we are already saying this is a book for a more elite audience, for a different audience from the theatre. And it's deliberately trying to do that. It's deliberately trying to look for a new market for drama in print, which isn't in any way really associated with the theatre, but which is associated with the study, with the sense that these are works that repay effort, they repay work, they're serious in the way that a work of theology or a work of philosophy might be serious. So they're a long way from that theatre world which created these plays. It's a really significant step, and although this year, this 400th anniversary year, has been about celebrating the fact that these plays were preserved, remember I said those 80% were lost because they weren't printed, and half of Shakespeare's plays are printed for the first time here, so pretty likely most of them, if not all, would have been lost if we didn't have this book. So the tone, of course, has been about celebration of this extraordinary book and the legacies that it's had in our world. But there is also a way of seeing this as a more negative, or at least a more nuanced step in the way that theatre, in this great time of its energetic entrepreneurial development, is moving from a mass art to a more elite one. And that, for me, as someone working on theatre, with theatre companies, and thinking about Shakespeare, that is our battle now, the perception that this is only an elite form. And this book, I'm afraid, has quite a lot to account for in that perception. Thank you. Oh, brilliant. So we can do hands up in the room, I hear. That's great. So if you would rather do that, do that. So have a think about some questions, and I'll just take a couple of questions while you're just thinking about what you would like to ask about. So Will, good name, Will. How did impresarios around the bearded bard use elites such as the monarchy to promote their interests? And how did they exploit their intellectual property through merchandise or otherwise? Yeah, that's a great question. We talked a little bit about the monarchy. You know, there's a... it's interesting to think who's benefiting. When James VI of Scotland comes to the throne of England, although we do not think that James was particularly interested in the theatre, he immediately, one of his first acts is to take on the patronage of the Chamberlain's men. It's almost as if he's buying a newspaper or something. You know, there is something about this media outlet which I think he thinks is valuable. It's going to be valuable to him. It's going to be add to his status, add to his reach in certain ways. So there's something perhaps a bit more reciprocal than Will's question has quite captured between, you know, who's benefiting in this relationship between the monarchy and the theatre companies. The question about intellectual property, I think, is a really interesting one. Apart from these books, there is no obvious merchandise, although it would be great to have some merch from the Globe, and we are very unclear. There's an argument really in this sphere in my field about whether these playbooks were commercially successful or not. We used to assume that plays in print were always commercially successful, and we generated this elaborate theory that people would pirate them. They were so successful that people would do the equivalent of going to the cinema and recording their film on their phone because there would be an outlet for that bootleg kind of copy. And we thought that people went to the theatre and wrote down, in some of the early forms of stenography or shorthand, wrote down what they heard and then sold these illicitly to publishers. So we had this enormously elaborate theory about pirated play texts, which was entirely dependent on the assumption that there was a huge amount of money to be made in these. We've now sort of looked again at the evidence for that, and that's what we would imagine in hindsight. There doesn't seem to be evidence at the time. Should we do one more? If has anybody got a question? Oh, great. Let's start here. Thank you.
I just want to ask about, was it 36 or 37 plays in the... Sorry. Was it 36 or 37 plays in the first folio? I only asked because I know the Royal Shakespeare Company did 37 plays, sort of call out to the nation.
Yeah.
And someone else said it was 38 plays, so I just thought I'd ask.
It's a great question. So there are 36 in the first folio. We don't have Pericles, and we don't have Two Noble Kinsmen, so that would take us to 38 if we counted those in. But there is a huge penumbra of plays which people have argued could be partly Shakespearean or not. Because once you admit that this isn't all of them, you've opened the floodgates, really. So I must ask the RSC what the 37 particularly referred to. I'm guessing it was these plus Pericles, but it should really have been these plus Pericles and Two Noble Kinsmen, which would be 38. But some people would, the most recent complete works of Shakespeare, I think, has 42 plays in it, and that's because of arguments that Shakespeare may have contributed to other plays that are not part of this this book.
Thank you.
And if you're adding them up, there are only 35 on the title page, and that's because Troilus, there's a different entrepreneurial conversation we could have about the stationer Henry Whalley, who owned the rights to Troilus and Cressida and was not going to sell them on for a price that could be agreed. So they go ahead thinking, okay, we're not going to get Troilus and Cressida, it's a shame, but we're not going to get it. Instead, we will put in its place Timon of Athens. So if Timon of Athens is a plan B, if Troilus and Cressida had come through, we wouldn't have had Timon of Athens. And we wouldn't know that we didn't have it because there's no other mention of Timon of Athens, it would be a Rumsfeldian unknown. And so Troilus only comes at the end after this has been printed. Yeah.
Could you say a bit more about women attending? Could you speak a bit more about women attending the theatre? You suggested that perhaps they didn't.
Yeah, so we've got very little evidence of, we've got very little clear evidence about this. And that's partly because of an absence of evidence about people going to the theatre more generally. I think it's certainly true that women go in larger numbers to Blackfriars than they went to the Globe, and part of the marketing of Blackfriars seems to have been that it was appropriate for women, and that we get plays which might be which might focus a bit more around female characters than we did at the Globe, and those things may all be interconnected. The descriptions we have of women at the outdoor theatres, like the Globe, suggest that they are prostitutes, they're sex workers working. Now, that's clearly not completely true, but if enough people are saying that, that's quite off-putting, I suppose, or that polices that space in a particular way. So my sense of the audience in the public theatre is that it was dominated by men. I don't think women were completely absent, but I think it was dominated by men. And we do have evidence of women going. Well, we do have references to women going, but they're all within sort of jokes and that kind of world, so it's hard to know how to assess that evidence. There's a very sort of bawdy joke about a woman who goes to the theatre and she's worried about what to do with her jewels while she's there, and so she puts them into her knickers. I don't know that they are her knickers, then when the play's finished, she's lost her jewels, and the person she's with says, well, didn't you feel anybody, and she said, oh yes, I didn't think they'd come for the jewels. So you can see that that's a story which is characterising the encounter of the theatre as kind of sexualised in ways which are not really respectable. But how true that is, that's a rhetorical. That's a joke doing certain kinds of work, isn't it? It's not a documentary. So I'm sorry, that's not a great answer. Yeah. It's you. Oh, you need. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. You need the microphone.
You said at the end there that sort of theatre needs to become less elite, which I completely agree with, and needs to sort of be more open. Open to bigger groups of people. Theatre is, however, of course, very expensive to put on. I was wondering what your opinion is in modern times. Shakespeare obviously had the patrons and those sorts of things. Do you think that's still important? To what degree is that important? Do you think that might help to make it less elite because then there's more money, or does that lend towards being more elite then?
Yeah, that's interesting. We've got a version of theatre which of mainstream theatre, which is quite spectacular, quite visually spectacular, and that is very, very expensive to produce. It's not completely clear that theatre needs to be like that, but if you're going to a West End theatre, there's a bit of a I feel there's a bit of a vicious circle. If I spend £85 going to the West End with not very good seats to see Hamilton, say, I want to see where's my £85 gone. So I want you all to have beautiful leather knee boots and, a sort of, I want to be able to see that. So we're in a sort of inflationary kind of cycle. I'm paying a lot. I want to see the fruits of that. They want to do more spectacular things, therefore I need to pay more. But there are lots of models of theatre which are actually much less expensive than that. And in some ways we saw some of those during lockdown. We saw more improvisatory theatre, a much more pared down theatre. Now it's interesting to think whether we will continue to support those kinds of theatres, that kind of theatre work, when there are other opportunities. It's clear that one of the extraordinary differences between the theatre of this period and the theatre of our own is that the Shakespearean theatre, the Globe Theatre, the Blackfriars Theatre, these were super profitable. These men were kind of millionaires, really, and Shakespeare is not a millionaire because he's a great writer, although that's part of it. He's because he's a shareholder in this very, very profitable entertainment business. Now, there are aspects of the theatre business which are a bit like that now, but not the classic theatre world. So that is going to need philanthropy and patrons in different ways. We don't know whether Shakespeare's patrons those noblemen ever gave any money. They perhaps gave a sort of a sense of protection, perhaps, rather than money. Thanks for the question. I'm just going to pick up one here. Was it possible that theatre companies have a practice of pickpocketing staff in the audience? Goodness me, that's somebody who's got a dark view of the world. I don't know. There were definitely pickpockets, as there are in any gathering, as we just heard with our friends Jules. But I don't know of any evidence that suggests this was part of the theatre company's side hustles, as it were. Was the more intimate and more expensive setting of the indoor theatre also viewed as immoral? Given people with acquisitive power could be socially better placed with a reputation to look after. Yeah, so that's interesting. So did the sense of the theatre, the place, the cultural value of the theatre increase with its increasing price? Yes, to an extent. It becomes a more respectable middle class, as it were, middling sort entertainment to go to. It's not so much that the indoor theatres are inside the city. They have negotiated sufficiently with the city to be allowed within the walls, rather than being in that insalubrious district, particularly in Southwark. So yes, I think it is improving. Although there's always a kind of moralistic sense that says these wealthy people are spending their money doing these terrible things, going to the theatre, for instance. And we have a distorted view of that because the people who are against the theatre in this period, who are mostly religiously motivated, write endless sermons and get them published. So their views have perhaps, perhaps slightly overstate the general view of that. These are religious fundamentalists, effectively, and their views may not have been widely held, but they are the voice of the anti-theatrical views of that time. Yeah, thanks.
Could you shed light on how theatre...
Sorry, if you wait for the microphone, I think it's easier for people who are not in the room. Thanks.
Did theatre influence mercantile adventures at that time? Queen Elizabeth, it was said, attended a play by Shakespeare, and that was what sort of inspired her to give the charter to the East India Company. Could you share?
Yeah, no, that's a really, really interesting question. So clearly the kind of entrepreneurial energies that I've talked about in a theatrical context are actually a much broader social energy. The growth of London that I talked about at the beginning, and particularly the growth of mercantile London and the Port of London, creates all kinds of business opportunities, including these early trading companies. So we get the East India Trading Company, the Virginia Trading Company, the Muscovy Trading Company trades with Russia, and lots of smaller, more speculative ventures thinking about global trade and colonization, as we see it mostly in retrospect, although it was kind of understood at the time. It is mostly, I think, at this point understood as a trading, as enabling trade. That's its sort of presenting motivation. Of course, there's a huge and complex history around that. So all that is definitely happening, and I think that what the theatre does is to, in some way, showcase a similar kind of travelling or adventuring. The theatre is very interested in stories that come from exotic places. Very increasingly interested in costuming. We get as English merchants begin to trade much more with the Ottoman Empire. We get lots and lots of plays about Turkish characters, about Islam, about forms of exchange between Christianity and Islam. So I think the theatre is doing the kind of social media work on behalf of those kinds of enterprises. I don't think it's a cause. For me, it doesn't look like a causal link, but they are definitely part of the same energy. And some people might argue that the theatre is sort of mainstreaming or socialising these ideas about global expansion by bringing them into the heart of London and having people see them there in the theatre. So for me it's not causal, but it's definitely connected. I think this is going to be the last one.
That's a really interesting situation you've talked about. How did the incoming influence work the other way? How did Elizabethan theatre translate into other countries with the trade that was going on between them?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, and I don't think I'm going to be able to answer that completely well. We don't know about... We know that the theatre companies do tour in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe. So there's quite a lot of crossover between Germany, German-speaking states, and northern France. So Protestant countries in Northern Europe have some kind of appeal for English theatre companies who tour there. And we get some German versions of these scripts. There's an early German version of Hamlet, there's an early German version of Titus Andronicus and of Romeo and Juliet, which all seem to be about these very, very early, late 16th, early 17th century tours of Europe. I don't think we know very much about early performances in some of these other spaces. There used to be an idea that on the coast of Sierra Leone, a performance of Hamlet was done on a merchant ship at the beginning of the 17th century. I think we now think that the evidence for that was faked, which is disappointing. But sometimes you hear about that story. We don't know. I've been thinking a lot about when the first playbooks or the first Shakespeare goes to the Americas. That's quite late, as far as we can see. It's a late 18th century thing. It's not before that. So I think it's. I don't think we know as much about the trade in the other direction, apart from more immediately in Europe. But thanks for the question. Is there any last one that anybody wants to squeak in? We can just squeak in this one, and I'll make a really quick, pithy answer.
Very quick.
I'll say yes.
Very quick. Okay. So the model you describe for Shakespeare is basically you have an actor-playwright with a company and a theatre, and that's the sort of successful model that they create around the globe and Blackfriars. Do the other companies also have the actor-playwright plus company and so on? And if so, what's happened to the plays?
Yeah, really, really great question. And I can't just say yes. In fact, I could just say no, they don't. So one of the things that's unique about the King's Men is they have this in-house dramatist, Shakespeare. Now that's almost certainly because he's a shareholder, so he's already on the books, if you like. But they undertake that he will write plays only for them, and they will perform those plays. Everybody else, so far as we know, is working on a freelance basis, who's a dramatist. So they pitch plays to particular companies, and then maybe with a outline or with a couple of scenes, and then the play they are commissioned to take it forward. Yeah. So that is a different model. That's an absolutely different model, and it means that no other playwright makes the kind of money that Shakespeare makes, because he is not primarily making money from being a playwright or from being an actor, but from being a shareholder. That's what makes him and that business model so successful. Thanks. That's a great end question. Thank you so much.